It's always hard to explain how an artist works. And because you can't explain it, then you have to bring up the word magic. You know, he starts a drawing and his hand goes into a direction and you really can't figure out what he's about to do.
His technique was impeccable. He was trained academically by his father. He would never make a silly technical mistake. He didn't have to have a palette and a little painting and just going around and making nice little paintings. He was, you know, doing something else. He was, you know, wreaking havoc.
And then suddenly you discover, after all, you thought it might become a woman, but actually it's a goat. But then his pen goes on and transforms it into a fish. It's a never-ending process. And that was what was interesting to him, to see where his mind would take him.
You know what it is? Voodoo. Do you understand voodoo?
My story about Picasso might as well start here as anywhere else. This is the Chateau de Castille. Douglas Cooper, the British art collector, and I lived here for 12 years. We moved in Douglas's great collection of pictures, and basically it became a private museum of Cubist art. Picasso, Braque, Léger, Juan Gris, from 1907 to 1914, and people started pouring in. After we bought this house in 1951-52, Picasso was one of our first visitors. Came and had dinner in this room, as he frequently would, again and again after the bullfights. Picasso would come with his entourage, he'd come with his new mistress, Jacqueline, he would come with Cocteau, members of his family, with Dominguin, the bullfighter. And if the dinners got too big, because this room held about 10 people, we would go and have great big dinners out there in the old silkworm building, where they used to keep silkworms, where the Picasso murals are. And we had many, many memorable dinners in this place. Picasso was born in Malaga, in the south of Spain, in 1881. At first, the midwife thought he'd been stillborn. In desperation, the doctor, who was his uncle, puffed cigar smoke into his face, whereupon little Pablo came to life with a great roar. At the end of his life, 90 years later, Picasso replayed the scene of his birth in this gory drawing. Picasso was named Pablo after his famously pious uncle, who was a canon of this great cathedral, this amazing Baroque building. And as a result, the church, Catholicism, the rituals of the cathedral were very much part of his life, his family's life. He came of an illustrious line of knights and clerics. There was great-uncle Pedro, who had lived as a hermit in the hills above Cordoba, and a famous forebear who had been Archbishop of Lima and Captain General of Peru. Later in life, Picasso always claimed to be an atheist, but as his widow, Jacqueline, told me, he was nothing of the sort. He was more Catholic than the Pope. I am God, Picasso was once overheard to say. I think we should remember that always at the root of Picasso's greatest work is this search for the sacred fire.
Remember, Andalusia, this southern extreme of the peninsula, is the most backward part of Spain. It lags behind. It's a very rural, very agrarian society. Even the cities have very little industry. Educationally, it lags behind, always has. So the superstitions are strong in Andalusia. Preoccupation with death is strong in Andalusia. Certain morbidity is strong
This is the Plaza de la Merced, where Picasso was brought up by a rather possessive and bossy mother. He had two old aunts who stayed at home, worked at home. There was a fiercely mustachioed old maid, and then, of course, there were his two sisters. His father, like most Andalusian fathers, was almost never at home. He was off running the art school, running the museum. He went to bullfights, and he was famous for being a wit in the local cafe, and also for going to whorehouses. But as Picasso grew up, he would see more of his father because it was his father who taught him how to draw. Picasso's father was a painter, and usually thought of as a very bad painter. A painter above all of pigeons. The town hall of Malaga bought this painting of pigeons in 1878, 3 years before Picasso was born. And is it really such a bad painting? Isn't it rather strong? Isn't it defiantly ugly? It seems to me that what the father has done is to capture the kind of pigeonness of pigeons. One of the most famous stories about Picasso's youth concerns an incident that took place when Picasso was 13 or 14, and his father, who had been training him as a painter, left him to paint the legs of a pigeon in one of his pigeon paintings. He'd actually cut the legs off the pigeon, nailed them to a board, left Picasso to copy this, and went for a walk. And when he came back an hour or two later, Picasso had painted the legs of the pigeon so beautifully that the father, Don Jose, said, "My God, you're a greater painter than I am. Here are my brushes, here are my paints, here is my palette. I'm not going to paint anymore." But I don't think this story is true. I think it was one of the legends that he came to believe about himself. But it's enormously interesting because Picasso went on to become one of the great pigeon painters of all time. I mean, we only have to think of the Dove of Peace, which is in fact a pigeon. As he told me once, he said, given the enormous amount of pigeons my father painted, I've gone into pigeon painting too. I'm repaying him in my pigeons. Behind me are the ruins of the famous Moorish castle, which dominates Malaga, with its crumbling hanging gardens and its dungeons and its battlements. And this used to be Picasso's favorite playground. He lived just over there around the corner. And he used to come here because this is where the gypsies hung out. And he loved spending mornings with the gypsies because they used to teach him tricks. They taught him cante hondo, they taught him flamenco, and they even taught him how to smoke a cigarette up one nostril. And this kinship with the gypsies stayed with him for the rest of his life. When Picasso was 10, his father lost his job at the local museum, and the family left sunny Mediterranean Malaga for cold, wet, blustery La Coruña, the northwesternmost point of Spain. How they all hated it. His father, Don Jose, had a good job teaching in the local art school, and they had a decent enough apartment. The art school where Don Jose taught and Picasso studied could be glimpsed from the balcony. Picasso always maintained that he never drew like a child. But we can't necessarily believe him because there aren't any of his childhood drawings left. Somebody must have destroyed them, and I suspect it was him. The first drawing we know is done at the age of 10, and it's not a particularly brilliant drawing. He said he drew like Raphael. It's nothing like Raphael. It's rather inept. And we see him becoming a great draftsman when he's here at this art school. Most students' drawings are as dead as the plaster cast they're drawing, but somehow Picasso's drawing is so sensuous and so alive and so sexy that you realized from it that he had to be on the way to becoming a great master. One other point I think is interesting, that he always loved plaster as a medium. He liked to work in plaster, and he much preferred the plaster, the whiteness of the plaster, the dirtiness of the plaster, the mess of the plaster, to bronze, which he always felt was museum-y and expensive and grand and too luxurious. I think Picasso always felt that his sculptures were magical in some respect, that they were like a witch doctor's fetishes, they were a shaman's creations. Do you agree with that?
I think they were very dear to him. I mean, actually, he never parted from his sculptures.
Never.
Actually, he never parted from the originals. Mm-hmm. And usually there were, two of each made, and one he kept and one was for sale, so that he could always hang on to them. Yes. And they were very much, part of the mobilier, of the furniture.
Yes, I remember we used to sit on the cats at the California. One of the fascinating things in your mother's book are the stories of Picasso's superstitions.
Yes.
And the intensity of them.
Absolutely. Actually, we never went out of the house without sitting on the steps and waiting for a minute so that we would know, to be sure that we would come back to the house. And through his life, he kept adding on new things. He had a lot of Russian manias that he'd gotten from Olga, and then, added on.
Invented ones. They were his own superstitions. They weren't necessarily.
Yes, they were, a bit of both. Some were from one partner or another, and some were invented. But he was very ritualistic, you could say.
Yes.
The streets of La Coruña were famous for their glassed-in balconies. Picasso enjoyed exploring the place. He was only 13, but his father kept him working away at models like this bearded tramp and the melancholy beggar girl who inspired what he called his first real paintings. Paintings he would keep until his dying day. Despite all this precocious mastery, Picasso very nearly gave up painting while he was at La Coruña.
Picasso's last wife, Jacqueline, told me a story which Picasso told only to the women in his life. And it involves the death of Picasso's youngest sister, Conchita, in 1895, who is buried here. Her family were too poor to provide a gravestone for her, so we don't know exactly which one it is, but there are these little numbered crosses, and maybe one of those refers to her. Now, Conchita developed diphtheria. There was an outbreak of diphtheria in La Coruña, and in those days it was a very fatal disease. There was a serum which was available in Paris, newly developed, newly invented serum, and while they were waiting for the serum to arrive, Picasso, age 13, made a vow to God that if his sister, whom he particularly loved, Conchita, lived, he would never paint again. The trouble was that he did paint again, and Conchita died. The result was that for the rest of his life, young women, young girls, in a way had to be sacrificed on the altar of Picasso's art. And it explains his relationships with so many women. It explains his identification with the Minotaur, the figure to whom girls, virgins, maidens had to be sacrificed. It explains his tenderness, his compassion, the extraordinary sweetness of many of his images of young women. And it also explains the darker side, the hint of menace that is always there. And this is so typical of Picasso's life, this paradox, this ambivalence towards everything he loved.
Poor Don Jose had hated La Coruña, hated the weather, hated his colleagues. And then on top of everything else, his beloved daughter had died. It was a great relief in the spring of 1895 to move to Barcelona and teach in the city's great art school. Although Picasso had been enrolled at the local art school, he was also apprenticed to a religious painter, because his father thought that there was a lot of money to be made in religious painting, and also there was a lot of fame to be made, and as the family had these religious antecedents, this seemed like a good idea. And so his first religious painting was this one, the First Communion of his sister Lola, and instead of a priest, and Picasso was proud of this detail, instead of having a priest in the conventional way, there's a clumsy altar boy who's fiddling with the vase of flowers. There's also this curious detail here, only 2 of the candles are lit. Now, I think this is a deliberate piece of allegory, because in the census taken a few years before, there is another member of the Picasso family noted, a boy child, and presumably there was a son who died. And this is a reference to the 2 living children, Lola and Pablo, and the 2 dead children, the dead baby and Conchita. This great big allegory, Science and Charity, was painted by Picasso when he was 15. It was a major bid for national celebrity. The painting was also intended as a tribute to Picasso's uncle Salvador, who was a very well-known doctor in Malaga, and who the family depended on for some of their finances. Picasso couldn't stand his uncle, but all the same, the doctor represents Uncle Salvador, but the role is played by his father, Don Jose. The girl in bed is in fact a beggar girl, a gypsy girl they found in the street, and after she was through posing, she pinched the blanket. The nun is not a nun. The nun is a boy dressed up as a nun in some borrowed habit. Mawkish subjects like this were very much in fashion. In this case, the allegory, supposedly a rather upbeat one of how great charity and science were together, science represented by the doctor, charity by the nun, isn't really working, as was the case with Conchita a year or so earlier. And there is this rather desolate feeling about the painting that all is not well, that the girl is going to die. And I think that is because it's done in memory of Conchita, and that is what comes through this painting.
Well, Picasso wrote Spanish badly also.
Did he?
Yes, he wrote Spanish full of mistakes.
Yes.
Well, Franco did the same. He was a very good Catholic.
I'm so glad you said that.
That is so clear.
That's so important that after church, there were a lot of whorehouses near the churches, weren't there? Here I am in the celebrated tavern El Quatre Gats, 4 cats in Catalan, which was the focal point of Picasso's Barcelona life. With me are the descendants of 2 of Picasso's closest El Quatre Gats friends. I mean, his father, Don Jose, was famous for going to whorehouses.
That's more Spanish. He was more Spanish-minded, you know.
Yes.
And here, his father didn't enter.
His father never came here.
No.
Well, Quatre Gats was the place in which the younger artists of...
It was here, at El Quatre Gats, that Picasso made his mark as a brilliant draftsman in a show of drawings of his fellow painters, writers, and students. No girls. It wouldn't have been respectable.
everything pointed to Paris. Paris was the mecca of the art world, so anybody born outside French borders would inevitably dream of coming to the capital and seeing where the action was. Picasso had Spanish friends there, friends from Barcelona. I mean, you know, it's the usual mythology of La Boheme. You know, attics, no heat in the winter, unbearable heat in the summer, communal sleeping, sharing beds, 8-hour shifts, etc., etc. And a lot of this sounds like the stuff of Puccini opera, but in fact, in Picasso's case, it was truth.
On his first trip to Paris, Picasso was accompanied by his best friend, Carles Casagemas, only a year older than himself, but already an anarchista and a decadente. He was also a gifted poet and painter, but already addicted to drink and drugs and probably a manic depressive, and he was totally dependent on Picasso.
These letters are half from Casagemas and half from Picasso, and they were sent to my father and my uncles. Well, they speak about the things they do in Paris, how they have to gain their life, to eat and to pay the apartment, and the friends they met in Paris. Well, the girls he did know in Montmartre, a little bit of everything.
And these are all letters which are enormously important. They tell us a great deal about these early trips to Paris and what they got up to, and they're quite amusing. I mean, a lot of funny details about the theatre they went to, the Grand Guignol, and all kinds of things.
They were very young people without much money, but they tried to amuse themselves. I like you.
This is where Casagemas ended his life, in February 1901. Picasso had fixed him up with a girl called Germaine, but Casagemas was impotent or sexually dysfunctional, so Germaine told him the relationship was over. At a farewell dinner in this Montmartre café, Casagemas tried and failed to shoot Germaine, and then shot himself. Picasso was away in Madrid at the time, but back in Paris he would commemorate his friend's death with this and 2 other agonized portraits, complete with bullet holes. 3 years after Casagemas blew his brains out, Picasso set to work on a puzzling allegory to be called La Vie. Until recently, it had been something of a mystery. Why was Casagemas holding his hand out like that? Why was Germaine clinging to him? What was all this about? I think I've solved the problem. The answer has to do with Picasso's recent experience and discovery of tarot cards. Anyone familiar with occult iconography will recognize the upward and downward gesture. It symbolizes the most famous of all mystical axioms. Whatever is below is like that which is above, as all things are made from one. X-rays reveal that underneath the figure of Casagemas is a self-portrait. It was originally to be about himself. He chose the name La Vie, and characteristically turns La Vie upside down. What this painting is all about is death. Later, Picasso said that the blue period had been inspired by Casagemas' suicide.
One thing that I always feel has to be stressed about Picasso's blue period is that it is not unique. People have always talked about it as if it was some sort of special invention of the young Picasso, and there are all sorts of myths that have to do with the fact that blue pigment might have been cheaper. Nothing of the sort. Blue was really the color of the moment, and it was synonymous with the sense of the spiritual, of the ethereal. It was a world that had to do with the airborne, with feelings, with a floating experience, anything that said goodbye to hard material facts of the 19th century. And there are artists galore who work in a similar tone. So that Picasso's blueness is just part of a general mood, an effort to join what is spiritual, saintly, melancholic.
This quaint little building, Lapin Gilles, hasn't changed since the beginning of the century. It was the headquarters of the Bande à Picasso, Picasso's gang. The gang consisting of writers Apollinaire, Max Jacob, and above all his girlfriends. And they used to come here night after night after night, and Freddy, the proprietor, used to play away at his guitar. Freddy had two sons, both of them bad hats. One of them, I think, got murdered here, if I remember rightly. And there used to be these fights between the artists and the Apache, the local gangsters, because the Apache used to come to get their girls back from the painters who'd made off with them, and there they were at the Lapin Gilles. And one of the most famous paintings associated with this place, it's called Au Lapin Gilles, is a painting of Picasso in Harlequin costume with Germaine, with whom he was now having an affair, but who had been the cause of Casa James's suicide. The disguise that he favored most, I suppose, was the Harlequin disguise. But it's not jolly commedia dell'arte Harlequin. I mean, it was a rather satanic figure, or at least a very ambivalent figure.
Andalusians celebrate Carnival. Carnival is all about masking. And I'm sure that Picasso must have observed Carnival. You just see it in his paintings. The Harlequin, of course, is a figure there. And again, in Carnival, that figure can be a figure of fun, as you say, but also can shade off into a sinister, dangerous, threatening, menacing figure as well. If you have a mask on your face, if you're not seen, you can't be identified. This frees you. It frees you to do whatever you want. You're free to engage in whatever misbehavior you want, sexual or political or otherwise. And of course, masking lets you experiment with different identities. You can literally change yourself into something else.
It's unusual in its size, of course. Picasso painted very few large-scale pictures, and when he did, they're always major statements. And the Saltimbanque certainly represents that kind of summing up. The realm that the Saltimbanques occupy in that picture was actually observed by Picasso on the outskirts of Paris. It's the fairgrounds where itinerant performers played, and this is where Picasso was able to watch acrobats in performance, but it was also a place where he could observe them living their marginal life. The fairgrounds themselves were literally separated geographically and socially from the center of the city, and the realm is sometimes referred to as the terrain vague, or vague realm, vague terrain, literally the outskirts or margins of society, but almost as if it's a landscape that represents not just another place but another time.
When he finally settled in Paris in 1904, Picasso moved into a squalid warren of studios called the Bateau Lavoir, known to poets as the Acropolis of Cubism. This ramshackle wooden hovel subsequently burned down. Outside was a little square with a fountain, which is where a few months later he would meet the woman who would become his first great love.
Elle vivait depuis 1901.
She'd been living since 1901 at the Bateau Lavoir. Picasso met her in 1904. She'd been a professional model since 1901. She'd posed for the greatest painters of the time. When Picasso arrived, he saw her. She was a truly beautiful woman. She had almost oriental, almond-shaped eyes, and she was shapy and luscious. She was a fine model and a very, very beautiful woman, which was why she was called La Belle Fernande.
La Belle Fernande. Bon. Et Picasso, voyez,
Picasso passed by this beautiful woman every day, but he never dared speak to her because he was so shy.
Qu'elle a tout de suite habité avec lui. Quand Fernande a commencé à habiter avec lui, un jour Picasso a dit...
When Fernande began living with him, Picasso said to her one day, "I want to show you something new." What he showed her was opium, and they began smoking opium in 1905.
Et à partir de ce moment-là, c'était deux, trois fois par semaine chez les...
From then onwards, they used to meet up with friends 2 or 3 times a week, either at somebody's house or in his studio. They brought a straw mat from the studio and they all smoked opium, either in the studio or at the homes of friends. It was opium that made Fernande feel her love for Picasso. It was under the effects of opium that she became aware of her love for Picasso.
By the spring of 1906, Picasso had been away from Spain for 2 years. He was desperate to get back. He wanted to go away for the summer, somewhere quiet, somewhere healthy, somewhere serene. And Casanovas, his great friend, the sculptor, had told him about Gozol. A great deal of the journey had to be done on muleback, and it was quite perilous. Part of it involved going up the side of a precipice with a huge drop on one side, rocks on the other. They were on muleback. Fernande's girths came loose. She started to topple off into the abyss, saved. On they went. Finally, after hours and hours and hours on mules, they got to Gozol, and it was paradise. It was everything they wanted it to be. And they settled in for the summer, and Picasso began to work and work and work. When Picasso moved to a new locality, the new locality nearly always is reflected in some way in his work. At Gozol, this was not the case. The subject matter is mostly nude boys, nude Fernandes. It's nothing much to do with the actual place, except in one respect, the color of the earth. The colors of Fernande in these beautiful paintings he did of her, particularly the big, tall nude, are the colors of this earth, of this red limestone, which you see all around you, this place which is called Las Rojas, and that permeates all the works that he did at Gozol. He embarked on a completely new style. It was freer, it was more idyllic. Fernande was his muse, his model. He was greatly inspired by her, and there was a feeling of kind of elation and joy in the work. This is where Picasso and Fernande spent 10 weeks in the summer of 1906. These little tiny rooms. How he managed to paint, I can't imagine. One of the paintings was virtually 7 foot tall, and there were 6 more big paintings, massive drawings, sketchbook. He brought back bits of wood and carved them. Somehow he managed all this. Okay, there's not much furniture. This is probably the original pieces of furniture. But they were sublimely happy here. And Fernande wrote letters saying that they were having a kind of honeymoon, and they were blissfully happy. And once they got back to Paris, they were never really happy again. Paris was boiling hot. The studio was stifling. Bed bugs had infested everything, and mice had got into the place. And to Fernand's horror, her banana-coloured parasol, her most treasured possession, had been devoured by mice. Over the next few months, Fernand's image would totally change. From being a sensuous, classicistic goddess, Fernand would be metamorphosed into a primitive earth mother, sturdy as a turnip, to quote an apt description of Picasso's recent model, Gertrude Stein. In the course of the summer, he had discovered a Madonna and Child in the church at Gozol, and this had had quite an impact on him. However, Picasso would always insist that the principal influence on his work of this period was an even earlier manifestation of Spanish art. When these primitive Iberian figures, 4th to 3rd century BC, were first put on view at the Louvre in 1906, Picasso was fascinated by them. This was something that he could use. They came from the part of the world that he came from, and he said to Apollinaire, the poet, his great friend, one day, "I'd love to have those." Unfortunately, Apollinaire's secretary, who was a kind of gay, criminal, gigolo, overheard all this, and he decided to go off and steal a couple of them so that Picasso could have his wish. He went off to the Louvre where they were shown. He saw that the guard was asleep. He took one out of the case, stuck it in his trousers, and walked out with it. So successful was it that he went back the following day and stole another one. And Picasso paid 20 francs or 30 francs for them, and they were very useful to him because they were imbued with the sacred fire that he was always after. This was the sacred fire of prehistoric Spain. And as usual, he did what he could with it until yet another Spanish source took its place. Picasso was one of the earlier admirers of El Greco, who around the turn of the century was a virtually unknown painter. When he was a student, he'd copied El Greco and horrified his father that his son should paint something so outrageous and mannered and absurd as an El Greco. And then a kind of acquaintance of his, a much better known Spanish painter, Zuloaga, flashy, flamboyant painter of portraits and genre scenes who would become Franco's favorite painter. Zuloaga, who had a house in Montmartre, had recently bought this great painting by El Greco, one of his masterpieces. And so he had the great good fortune to have a major old master round the corner, and inevitably the experience is reflected in his work. Not immediately. It wasn't until he started work on the Demoiselle d'Avignon that he bethought himself of this painting. And it is no coincidence that the canvas he ordered for the Demoiselle is virtually the same size as this painting. But that is not all. The extraordinary darkness of the Demoiselle, the malevolent feeling that one gets, the sense of evil, the sense of heaven and hell, all these things that Picasso was out in his search for magic to put into his imagery. I think all of this comes, in a way, from this great painting. Picasso had taken a cellar in the Bateau Lavoir, a dark cellar. It was very, very hot. He stripped naked in order to paint it. He was 5'3", the women about 8 foot tall, and night after night he would work away at this painting. His mistress, Fernand, locked away upstairs, as she said, waiting, waiting, waiting for Picasso, who would be in an ever worse temper. And then, while he was battling away with the Demoiselle, Picasso found a solution. He paid a visit to the Ethnographical Museum at the Trocadero. By accident, he always said. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Tribal art was to have an enormous impact, not only on the demoiselle, but on Picasso's view of art as having a magic function. All alone in that ill-lit, filthy, smelly, cluttered museum, he later said, I understood that the Negroes used their sculpture as weapons. Art could kill, it could exorcise. Tribal art made Picasso understand why he was a painter.
What struck me in the demoiselle was that the two evil demoiselles, the African ones, those that he said were inspired by African masks and figures in the Trocadero, and which were evil spirits, he didn't know what it was. Only those two on the right, when we look at it, only those were mutilated and incomplete. He punished them magically on the canvas.
One is blinded, isn't she?
One is blinded.
In other words, Picasso saw himself as a shaman.
He saw himself
because
as
this is
a
a
shaman.
shaman's view of...
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This Nudes in the Forest of 1907 was probably the most important painting at the Château de Castille. And I remember Douglas bought it for the equivalent of $10,000 in the pawn shop at Geneva. Picasso used to come quite often, and he admired this painting, particularly because he said it was all done in one go. It was done like a Van Gogh with this tremendous energy. And we asked him about its references to tribal sculpture, and he said yes, he did have tribal sculpture in mind, and that the brush strokes followed the scarifications that are such a feature of certain tribal sculptures.
Cubism is a much less analytical, geometrical thing than I think we used to think. We needed to boil it down in a way in order to understand the formal development. But there's also something shadowy and dark and haunting about Cubism that is even more compelling. I think we can say that to the degree that Picasso was interested in various aspects of magic, that Cubism itself should probably be understood partly in relation to that theme in Picasso's work and in his life. There's no question that the transformation of objects and of figures and of faces in Cubism has an enchanted quality, and when we talk about breaking down and remaking the body or the face, we talk about something that is almost a supernatural discipline. It is a display on the part of the artist of mastery over his subject, of complete control, of a godlike power.
Cubism, a silly word invented by an antagonistic critic, was in fact a partnership with another progressive young painter, Georges Braque. For the next 7 years, the two artists were inseparable, like two mountaineers roped together, Braque said. So we have to see Cubism as a combined operation. When they were in Paris, Picasso and Braque used to visit each other almost every evening, check out on what the other one had done. When they went away for the summer, they worked even more closely together. Here are two paintings done at Serret, French Catalonia, 1911, one by Braque and one by Picasso. Now, they are extremely alike, but there are certain things which differentiate the two. In this painting by Braque, which is a still life, there were bullfights nearby over the frontier in Spain, and so we have references to bullfighting. We have the two banderillas. You see the spikes on it. We have torero, reference to a bullfighting poster. We have a bottle,
and a glass, more than one glass, and the composition is fairly readable. Here, it's more legible. You know it's at Ceret, the reference to the name C-E-R, that's Ceret. Here is a table, bottle of rum, glass, and sheet music. And it's less exquisitely painted than the Braque. Braque was a marvelous painter and took hours, months over his paintings. Picasso does it in a much more summary, more direct, and more graphic way. And although it's easier to see the similarities than the dissimilarities, the more you look, the more you can see that they are by two separate painters with separate vision.
Fernande loved his blue period. She loved his rose period because she was its muse and model. But she didn't understand Cubism. You asked me to tell you about Picasso's final separation from Fernande. They were no longer at the Bateau Lavoir. They left the Bateau in 1909. They went to live in the Boulevard Clichy. It was there they met a couple, Marc Coussis and his woman Marcel Imbert. Marcel and Fernande became very close friends. Picasso and Fernande were arguing more and more. Their relationship had grown stale. To rekindle Picasso's interest in her, Fernande spent a few days with an artist called Hoppy. She wanted to teach Picasso a lesson and hoped he would take her back. But Picasso took advantage of the situation and made off with Marcel Imbert, who called herself Eva.
Curator of 19th century French painting at the Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg, in Russia. 10 years ago I was in this hall. It was the end of working day, no public. It was very dark. In the dark, accidentally, I saw small inscription on this painting. It's only 3 letters, E-V-A, but this is very important letters because it means the name of Eva Guet, this Picasso lover. Her real name was Marcel Imbert, but it was known as Eva Guet. Usually this painting was called violin and clarinet. But right now, scholars noted that it's a special kind of clarinet. It's tenor, Spanish kind of clarinet. Picasso didn't miss opportunity to note his Spanish origin. After this, I understand much better this painting because I see that it's very important painting for Picasso. It's a secret message. Maybe it's like code, maybe puzzle for Picasso to represent this woman.
Sometime in 1913, Picasso's beloved Eva fell ill. She told people she had TB as she didn't want them to know that she had cancer. Probably cancer of the breast, to judge by this amazing image done in 1914, in which Picasso portrays her tenderly but also monstrously. Her beautiful pointed breasts nailed to her body by an alternate set of nipples. By 1915, Eva would be confined in a clinic. Picasso, who had had a psychic terror of illness in women ever since the death of his sister Conchita, screwed up his courage and went to visit her every single day. To help him through this nightmarish ordeal, he embarked on a very secret affair with a woman called Gaby de Pere. As Eva lay dying, Picasso fell more and more in love with Gaby. He took her away to Saint-Tropez for a few days. He sent her love letters, illustrated with watercolors of the rooms where they'd stayed. He entwined his name with hers and told her he loved her in every possible color. This puzzling painting, painted in 1914 in Avignon, was found only after Picasso's death. He'd kept it hidden ever since he painted it and showed it to nobody. And one can see why. On the right, you see Eva. It's almost the only figurative representation of her. It's probably one of the first attempts on his part to leave Cubism and try out some kind of more representational style. And then, in December 1915, Eva died. 2 months later, Picasso asked Gaby to marry him, but she turned him down. Picasso was more than ever tormented with grief and guilt, self-pity and despair. Remember, too, that this was one of the darkest periods of World War I. Most of Picasso's closest friends were away at the front, and he felt very, very alone. Shortly before Eva died, he had expressed his despair in a self-portrait in the form of what else but a harlequin. For many years, nobody even noticed that Picasso had left a profile of himself, a shadowy one, on the white rectangle that the harlequin holds. Picasso portrays himself spotlit against the blackness of Eva's mortal illness and the blackness of war. Indeed, where are we? Golgotha? No man's land? Surely not Montparnasse.